ask whether the American university has become too political, I certainly believe that they are asking the wrong question. The real question that concerns all of us is, what is education for? Is education simply designed to produce knowledge, to prepare workers, to preserve a tradition, or to produce thinkers? Or should education produce problem solvers, advance society, prepare democratic citizens to govern? Or does it have a moral obligation to confront the unique injustices that plague society and expand human freedom? This is the question of this fourth episode of the Black Public Square. Paulo Freire once said, "Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon the world in order to transform it." Every philosopher of education have to some degree wrestled with the question of what is education for. And they have debated vigorously over higher education, democracy, morality, and the future of society. As you log on Twitter and on social media, and even in some op-eds published in the Higher Education Journal, you'll see that some people, or some academics, shall I say, and policymakers too, are asking the wrong question. Has higher education become too political, these people are asking? And my response is that's already a political question. Because deeply embedded within this line of thinking is the assumption that the university should do what scholars study. Who counts as legitimate? Whether scholars have an obligation beyond producing knowledge. Instead of asking, has our higher education become too political, we should be asking this: what is the purpose of education? The moral purpose of education and different philosophies of education contend that a liberal arts education prepares thinkers to engage in critical reasoning, to wrestle with questions around democratic citizenship, to reflect on ethics, and solve society's problem by advancing society. But when we think of a technical education, its primary purpose has been workforce development, preparation for career skills, economic productivity. These debates are continuing to define American political discourse, with many people asking, is college really worth it? And has college become too ideological? And has a college education lost its value? If we reproduce education as simply job training alone, what happens to democracy? Who teaches people to think critically? Who prepares students to evaluate evidence critically? Who teaches history, ethics, politics, literature, philosophy? A democracy needs more than just workers. A democracy needs engaged, participatory, and analytical citizens. Black scholars have never had the luxury of studying injustice as an abstract intellectual exercise. Our work emerges because communities confronted slavery, segregation, disenfranchisement, lynching, educational exclusion, economic apartheid. Scholars like W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Charles Hamilton Houston, Derrick Bell, Anna Julia Cooper, Carter G. Woodson, James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, and so many more have contributed to what does it mean to navigate a world in which white supremacy is rampant. You see, a primary example of Black scholars not having the luxury of being neutral when it comes to politics is the creation of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Why? Because many Black political scientists believe that the discipline in the 1960s refused to take seriously the conditions of people of the African diaspora. And it reflected in the subfields, the scholarship, and even what departments looked like. If we're being honest, universities have never been neutral. When exactly was a university apolitical? Universities participated in and perpetuated and created structures that reinforced segregation. Universities excluded women on the basis of gender. Universities excluded Black scholars who were indeed qualified. When we think about curriculum decisions, the canon formation of disciplines, who's been hired, who's been promoted, neutrality has never existed in the halls of the academy. You see, the George Floyd era ushering in a period that was short-lived in American politics of white guilt. Many universities promised diversity, equity, and inclusion. They felt bad because their departments didn't reflect the populations that they were serving. They knew inherently that the institutional practices that they had engaged in promoted white supremacy and racism. But yet, after that, many of them committed to DEI. But how much of that commitment has survived? You see, in my own work, I found that whites will support diversity in principle, but will reject it when it will, in principle, as an abstract idea, but will reject it when it comes when confronted with concrete principles. Many should ask, were these institutions truly ever committed to diversity, or was it simply symbolic? In major political discourse this week, we see Vanderbilt University released a report criticizing the humanities. And many scholars suggest that this report was just as political as it claims to rail against politics. They argue that the humanistic social sciences have become so increasingly shaped by ideological commitments rather than open scholarly inquiry. The report argues that some disciplines discourage intellectual disagreement, substitute political commitments for rigorous debate, and this have contributed to declining public trust in higher education. The report calls for greater viewpoint diversity and a renewed scholarly rigor and recommitment to the pursuit of truth. Recently, also, the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, released a report. They argued that the greatest threat facing higher education today is not internal ideology, but external political interference. It documented how governments, policymakers, and boards and political actors have attempted to influence hiring, curriculum, faculty governance, research, and academic freedom. The report warned that these efforts threaten the independence of the university and its democratic processes. But yet, as a precursor, the Board of Trustees at Vanderbilt University has taken an unprecedented action. They have essentially put together a report and have adopted the idea that if faculty fail to live up to the duty of individual collective scholarly standards and promote social or political agendas, they could be punished. The board expanded this threat against any faculty member deemed to promote evil political ideas in the classroom. Quote, faculty individually and through academic units fail in their responsibility if course offering, syllabi, or class discussions suppress or promote ideas and perspectives that are rooted in political or personal commitments as opposed to academic merit. There is nothing wrong about promoting perspectives that have political commitments. In fact, intellectual diversity requires this because some viewpoints include political commitments. This is unprecedented because it suggests that those who do activism cannot divorce their politics from the way in which they approach scholarly questions. Clearly, these people have not read any of the works of leading academics. These two reports, or three reports, simply disagree on higher education. They represent competing visions about what the university should look like, who should shape the mission, what classes should be taught, and who should be teaching them. The claim that universities have become too political in itself is a political claim. It reflects assumptions about what scholarship should be accomplished, who gets to define what is legitimate knowledge, what is the role universities should play in democracy, and whether scholars have ethical responsibilities beyond producing knowledge. You see, to study race and democracy, poverty, inequality, voting rights, and so many other things, you have to at least have your ear in tune with what's happening to the larger systems. It is not neutrality that will be the problem teaching in the classroom. It is the idea of not fighting for a society that promises justice. It is a political decision about what scholarship should be ignored. Scholarship should not be diminished because it confronts justice, and scholarship is not diminished when it refuses to examine the human consequences of power. Close. The real question is not whether universities have become too political. Universities have always been. The fundamental fact is, as we think about the commitments that universities made around diversity, equity, and inclusion, now we're seeing somehow that those who study race, injustice, suffering, have somehow traded their scholarly training in exchange for lower standards and pursuit of simply activism. Yet we know that universities have been slow to change their tenure and promotion scholarship standards. We know that the university remains severely underrepresented when it comes to the representation of Black and brown people. I, I comport that these very same people who are somehow suggesting that the university have become too political are the very same people who have pushed back against diversity, equity, and inclusion, attacked Black and brown scholars, and they somehow feel excluded because the academy, within the last couple of years, to some extent, have eliminated a multiplicity of barriers that have existed for Black scholars. That isn't to say that there are more barriers that still exist. What's also interesting about this conversation, at the same time that people are suggesting that universities have become too political, we're seeing a rise in authoritarianism across the United States, a rise in authoritarian regimes, a rise in the number of autocratic states that are now exist on the global stage. We see a massive erosion of democracies. These attacks on higher education at this moment in time should not be understood separate from what is happening in the larger political context as oligarchs and authoritarians seize political power. As we suppress universities that are knowledge producing institutions, truth seeking institutions, having and engaging in conversations that are even unpopular, the first step of an authoritarian regime is to cut off the head of the intellectuals, because they are the individuals who are going to ask the critical questions. And as America see a decline in trust of all major political institutions, as well as higher education and so many other elements, we've got to ask ourselves, what does this have to do with the kind of society we want to live in? As we're seeing Black and brown scholars attacked by right-wing activists, as we're seeing universities root out Black faculty and deploy admission standards that seek to exclude Black and brown students, these are things that should always concern us. I also want to say this. When it comes to the scholarly practice, the scholarly standard, the pursuit of norms, the practices in each of these academic disciplines, you'll be surprised to discover that a lot of this has to do with gatekeeping. And as more Black and brown scholars pursued PhDs, entered departments, and worked their asses off to prove their worth, their value, their commitment to the university each day, many of them have still faced unprecedented opposition in their departments, on their campuses. And this is open season both on Black intellectual thought, Black institutions, Black politics, Black representation. I oftentimes ask myself, where are they going to end? What is the end result? Is it a return to chattel slavery? What is also telling about this moment is how deeply embedded capitalism is into how we move and how we think. There are so many people who are afraid to speak out because they believe that they will be targeted, but your silence won't protect you. The scholars that these people have come for have been top notch, and I have no doubt that they will continue their crusade on Black and brown scholars. Another interesting conversation that has happened this week is Tuskegee University sent a letter to parents for their incoming class indicating that they were going to ban bonnets, do-rags, and headgear in public spaces. And in the Black public square, or either Black public counter discourse, we began to see that some suggested that this policy was anti-Black and had no place at a historically Black college or universities. Others argued that this particular move was an attempt to prepare students for the workplace. And one of the great tensions that arise in this conversation was sort of twofold. On the one hand, how do you teach Black people to navigate a world that's inherently anti-Black, where they're going double standard, versus how versus looking out for the overall protection of a group and allowing people to live unapologetically. This debate reminded me of the age-old debate about routes to black liberation. Some believe that we should do what we can professionally. Others believe that we should resist all kinds of systems. And black people live unique lives in this world, having to navigate a world and roads that are always drenched in what I call white supremacy. But I want us to think about this. The historically black university serves a different mission and a different purpose from predominantly white institutions. You see, black institutions were safe havens for black families during the period of Jim Crow and post-Civil War. These institutions became the vehicles of upward mobility for thousands of African American families that sought jobs as service workers, whose grandparents and great grandparents didn't get to attend college, but because their parents worked at these universities as service workers and janitors and other maintenance workers around campus, the campus became a vehicle for upward mobility. You see, I attended a historically black college, and we had professors who talked to us about professionalism, who taught us how to dress, how to tie a tie. These traditions, were they rooted in anti-blackness? Perhaps not. But I think that they were teaching us to prepare for a world in which we would be judged, where we would have to be 10 times better and probably would still be judged negatively. So I say all of this to say, those who are engaged in having a conversation about Tuskegee's dress code policy first need to understand that historically black colleges have completely different missions from white institutions. What's also apparent is that there were different reactions among people who had attended historically black colleges and universities and those who had attended white schools. You see, those who had attended white schools, the conversation quickly shifted to, oh, we have black schools, HBCUs should be worried about their retention rates and their admissions. And this is a legitimate concern. But if you're going to talk about retention rates, you got to have that additional context about how these institutions continue to do more with little resources. And so as we think about liberation in this moment, we've got to have a politics that makes room for everybody. And we cannot operate on a politics that requires all of us to be on one route to liberation. That has never been the tradition. And so I hope today that as we talk about whether the university has become too political, much of this conversation is really not about the university becoming political, because the universities have always been a political system. Research the American higher education system and its ties to slavery. Go back and look at the 1960s and 70s and 80s and look at their admissions policies and the unprecedented steps that many of these universities took to keep African Americans out. Go back and look at many of these departments that have never once hired a black person. And of the few black people they do have, they use them as tokens. They're not valued. Their research is undervalued. And I would never thought that a group of academics who would prepare to criticize the humanities for a lack of scholarly standards wouldn't analyze a single piece of work to subject it to the standards that are in the discipline. You see, we only talk about standards when black people are involved. We don't talk about the young white boy who is mediocre and gets promoted in the department. We don't talk about the white women who skate through processes who do very little work for departments. We don't talk about how black people have to work their asses off just for a seat at the table. And when we're at the table, it's microaggressions, it's racism, it's structural inequality, it's an erosion and a movement of standards. I'm not sure who's listening and who isn't, but here's what I want to tell my beautiful black people. We belong, we are brilliant, and though they may attack us, they may come after our livelihoods, they may even destroy our livelihoods at some point. But guess what? They will never take the moral clarity that we possess when it comes to fighting for justice, fighting for liberation, and fighting for people. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Black Public Square. Join me next week for another episode as we do a hot take on American politics and the midterms elections. I am Dr. Emmett Riley, your host of the Black Public Square. You can subscribe on Spotify or follow us on YouTube for all of our updates. Thanks for tuning in and have a great week.